initiating the ready opening signals a flexible development, prioritizing piece activity over immediate pawn structure establishment. Establishing a central pawn presence immediately challenges white's knight and opens lines for development. Opening a diagonal for the bishop and reinforcing the center, a solid, if slightly passive, step. Developing a knight to a natural square, reinforcing the center and preparing for kingside castling. Challenging black's central grip, this pawn advance seeks to disrupt their established structure and potentially open lines for piece activity. Solidifying the center, black prepares to develop the kingside pieces and challenge white's queenside pressure. Securing the center, this knight readies for a central pawn push or a quick sortie. Releasing central pressure, black sacrifices a pawn for immediate piece activity, hoping to disrupt white's developing harmony. Recapturing the pawn with the bishop immediately challenges black's central control and opens a diagonal for the queen. Securing the queen's bishop's path ahead prevents an immediate pawn fork, subtly reinforcing the central pawn structure. Securing the queenside pawn advances aggressively, preventing black's typical b5 counterplay and creating immediate pressure along the newly opened diagonal for white's bishop, potentially opening lines towards black's king sooner than anticipated. Opening the queenside to activate the light-squared bishop, black subtly challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the queenside space, potentially preparing for a queenside expansion later. Asserting central influence, white stakes a claim for the d4 square, aiming to develop a more robust pawn structure and potentially unleash the light-squared bishop. This bold pawn push prepares to challenge black's queenside expansion and opens lines for white's pieces. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal offers a robust response, immediately challenging white's central influence and preparing for future kingside operations. Securing the monarch is paramount, a vital consolidation for future operations. Challenging the center directly with c5 is a bold attempt to seize initiative, injecting dynamism into the position. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and create immediate counterplay by targeting the d4 pawn and opening lines for black's pieces. The move injects significant tension, forcing white to immediately consider how to address the central pawn structure and potentially open lines that could favor either side depending on white's response. Black is gambling for active piece play and a more dynamic middle game by pushing the c-pawn. The opening of the c-file might become a key factor in the ensuing play, offering black lines for their rooks if the tension is resolved favorably. Deploying the queen to e2 prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm with f4 and solidifies the central pawn structure, while also offering an escape square for the king should the center open up. Immediately challenging the center and accepting the pawn, black prioritizes activity over material. This exchange opens lines, forcing white to consider how best to redeploy their pieces. The capture creates a dynamic pawn structure, potentially leading to a more open middle game where piece play will be paramount, and white's queen placement at e2 might feel somewhat exposed if black can quickly activate their pieces. Liberating the center. The pawn's advance opens a diagonal for the queen and reclaims vital central space, simultaneously challenging black's d5 pawn and potentially forcing a decision about the central structure. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal opens up possibilities for increased influence on the center and potential kingside play. Opening the d-file to challenge black's central pawn structure and prepare for potential pressure on the enemy, king, feels like a very natural continuation after black's last pawn capture. Safeguarding the monarch through castling aligns perfectly with established opening principles, securely tucking the king away behind a pawn shield and bringing a rook into play. This move, while standard, is crucial at this juncture for several reasons. It removes the king from the center, which is becoming increasingly contested, and prepares the rook on h8 to potentially join the defense or later participate in central play. Considering white's knight on c3 and bishop on c4, castling prepares to counter any immediate central advances and consolidates black's position before committing further resources. The pawn structure on the king side, now reinforced by the king's retreat, appears stable for the moment. The bishop, now active on its long diagonal, pressures the queenside and prepares to potentially challenge black's central pawn structure or aid in a kingside assault. Diverting the knight from its central outpost to potentially disrupt white's pawn structure by offering an exchange. This move introduces a dynamic element into the position. Black gambles on the idea that creating an imbalance might be more advantageous than maintaining a solid, albeit slightly passive, setup. The knight, now on d5, acts as a wedge, forcing white to decide how to address the immediate threat and potentially altering the pawn skeleton in the center. This injection of tactical complexity could prove fruitful if white mishards the subsequent exchanges, or if black can exploit any resulting weaknesses. Relinquishing control of the e4 square is a notable concession, allowing black's knight a prime post. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, aims to provoke a structural weakness or an overextension from black, offering compensation for the sacrificed central space. Observe how the bishop's relocation prepares for a potential queenside expansion later, or perhaps supports a gradual buildup on the kingside. The long-term viability hinges on whether white can effectively exploit any ensuing pawn chain imbalances or create a decisive attack on the weakened king's defenses. Establishing centralized knights is a fundamental principle, and NC6 now squarely positions this piece to contest control of d4 and potentially pressure white's queenside if white overextends on the c-file. This develops black's coordination, creating a more robust structure to withstand white's positional ambitions. Sacrificing the knight on d5 opens a critical diagonal for the queen and aims to dismantle black's pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses on the queenside. Re-establishing pawn structure after the capture creates immediate central tension, but the isolated pawn on d5, while adding a potential outpost for a knight, also becomes a long-term target and can restrict queenside development for black. Repositioning the bishop to d3 clears the way for the rook on c1 to potentially activate along the c-file, while also offering a stable post from which it can eye the kingside. And importantly, it prepares the c4 pawn to advance later, aiming to break open the center and challenge black's central pawn mass. Injecting a knight to the b4 outpost signals a bold attempt to disrupt white's carefully constructed central pawn chain and exert pressure on the queen. This maneuver, while seemingly aggressive, carries inherent risks. The knight, once centralized, could become a target if white manages to generate a strong counterattack on the queenside or through the center. Black is clearly aiming to create imbalances and avoid a symmetrical, potentially drawish struggle. The position is becoming increasingly complex, with both sides jockeying for advantageous squares and preparing for a positional skirmish that could spill over into tactical fireworks. The placement of the knight on b4 demands precise defensive and offensive calculation from both players moving forward. Relocating the bishop to b1 aims to free up the c2 square for the knight, creating a more solid pawn structure and preparing to potentially contest the c-file if it opens. The pawn advances, creating a robust defensive chain on the queenside, a solid bulwark against any immediate knight incursions, but simultaneously ceding a crucial outpost on b4 to your opponent's bishop, and potentially limiting the scope of your own queenside pieces in the long run. Unlocking central activity, white injects the knight into enemy territory, threatening disruption around black's king and potentially creating outposts on squares like c6 or f7, if black mismanages their defenses, while simultaneously putting pressure on the d5 pawn. Creating a harmonious pawn structure around the king is the immediate goal, reinforcing the king's safety amidst white's active pieces, and opening up a potential avenue for the dark-squared bishop on f8. The rook's relocation to the third rank, though seemingly passive, aims to re-establish pressure along the semi-open file and potentially support a future b4 push, thus contesting black's queenside space and disrupting their pawn structure before the initiative is lost. The bishop's journey to a6 directly challenges white's advanced knight, aiming to trade off a potentially troublesome piece and simplify the position, while also preparing to exert pressure along the a6-f1 diagonal, potentially disrupting white's queenside control or supporting future pawn advances. The queen relocating to d2 aims to bolster the center and prepare for a potential kingside assault, but it also subtly concedes kingside defense to the otherwise exposed monarch. An intriguing repositioning, the rook on c8 immediately stakes a claim on the open file, challenging white's centralized queen and setting up potential battery formations with the bishop on e7. This move signals black's intent to contest the center and perhaps generate counterplay down the c-file, aiming to disrupt white's otherwise solid pawn structure and active piece placement. Solidifying the bishop's influence on the central diagonal, this repositioning aims to eye the kingside and potentially support a future pawn advance, while simultaneously freeing the d-file for further rook activity should the opportunity arise. Black offers a strategic sacrifice, aiming to dismantle white's centralized bishop and gain attacking momentum by opening a diagonal for the queen and potentially activating the rook on c8. Deploying the rook to the third rank heralds an aggressive intent, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. The rook's purposeful relocation to the open file, aiming for the e8 square, immediately sets the stage for future pressure along the central file, potentially liberating the queen and creating a formidable battery with the bishop on e7. Preparing to contest the crucial d-file, white repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to increase pressure on black's central pawn structure and potentially prepare for a kingside attack. That retreat of the bishop back to g7 appears to be a defensive reinforcement, solidifying the kingside pawn structure and offering a subtle escape square for the king if the queenside pressure escalates. Recentering the queen on the f4 square creates an immediate tactical fulcrum, eyeing the vulnerable g6 pawn and subtly questioning the robustness of black's kingside pawn structure. Challenging the central initiative, this move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the vulnerable white king and potentially preparing for a queenside expansion or support for a central pawn push. Swapping queens here drastically alters the game's complexion, immediately ushering in an endgame scenario where pawn structure and piece activity will reign supreme. White relinquishes the initiative and the potential for mating attacks, but gains a clear path to activate the rook on the h-file, potentially eyeing the now exposed dark squares around black's monarch. The lingering weakness on d5 for black becomes a key strategic target, demanding careful maneuvering to defend it effectively. This decision is a calculated risk, betting on superior piece coordination in the simplified position. A pivotal moment as the bishop exchanges, clearing the way for the rook to potentially contest the c-file and enabling the knight to redeploy for central influence. The bishop retreats to its active diagonal, eyeing the central squares and preparing to support a potential advance of the kingside pawns. Repositioning the bishop to g7 clarifies its defensive role and potentially prepares for a later advance, though it does surrender some central influence. Fortifying the c3 square opens avenues for the rook, aiming to challenge black's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially support a future c4 push, while simultaneously creating defensive redundancy against any immediate threats on the center files. Solidifying the pawn chain with f6 is a sound decision to prevent any immediate breakthroughs by white's pieces, particularly the knight on e5 and the rooks that now have access to the c-file. This move also aims to create a more robust defensive structure around the king, anticipating white's efforts to exploit any weaknesses. However, it does slightly restrict the dark-squared bishop's scope on g7, making its future deployment a key strategic consideration. The king's safety is paramount, and this appears to be a defensive step in that direction, acknowledging the pressure white is applying. Re-establishing knight presence in the center, this repositioning aims to contest the now open d-file and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while simultaneously shoring up the weakened dark squares around white's monarch. Black aims to activate the bishop, preparing to redeploy it to a more central square or potentially exchange it for white's active knight on f3, which currently guards against pawn advances on the kingside. This bishop maneuver seeks to improve piece coordination and challenge white's central presence. Opening up the central column for your rook is a bold choice, aiming to exploit the pawn structure's weaknesses that black has inadvertently created. Capturing the rook immediately simplifies the position, a logical choice for black aiming to neutralize white's attacking potential on the c-file. Opening the b-file for your rook now offers a new dimension of counterplay, forcing the black bishop to retreat and disrupting their defensive structure. A fascinating attempt to disrupt white's central dominance by introducing a knight into a pocket of relative safety. Black hopes to exploit the weakened dark squares and potentially create attacking chances against white's king, but this outpost will require careful maintenance if it's to prove more than a temporary annoyance. Unlocking the d-file by capturing the knight dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a potentially passed pawn for white on the queen side while solidifying black's central pawn chain. This exchange promises a more open game where piece activity and initiative will be paramount. Reclaiming the bishop offers a much-needed pawn majority on the queenside for black, potentially paving the way for a later queenside expansion and pressuring white's somewhat isolated d3 pawn. Reclaiming the central square after that tactical skirmish offers a chance to reorganize the pieces for a renewed assault, repositioning to challenge the bishop pair's influence. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the queen side, this maneuver seeks to exploit the newly opened diagonal towards white's king after the recent exchange, aiming to coordinate with the rook and potentially create new attacking avenues. Unlocking the c-file for a potential breakthrough, this move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the queen side and preparing to support a central advance or create threats against black's king. Securing the bishop's retreat to a more active diagonal, this maneuver aims to reinforce black's queenside pawn structure against potential future incursions, while also freeing the knight to reposition for a more central role. A tactical realignment begins as the rook slides to the open file, seeking to exploit the pawn structure's weaknesses and potentially launch an offensive on the king side. The rook's redeployment to the c-file immediately asserts pressure, aiming to contest control and potentially infiltrate white's position, especially after the recent pawn exchanges have simplified the structure and opened up lines. Unlocking the c-file for your rook is the immediate objective, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure after the exchange on d3 and generate pressure along that open path towards black's king. Targeting the rook on a1, this maneuver seeks to create an immediate thorn, potentially forcing a concession or at least disrupting white's coordinated pieces. And while it repositions a piece to a more active square, it neglects a defense against the upcoming pawn push on the queen side. Consolidating the rook on the b-file aims to contest this open highway, preventing black from freely maneuvering their pieces along it, and preparing for potential exchanges that might simplify into a more favorable endgame for white, capitalizing on their slightly better pawn structure. Black's rook now occupies a crucial outpost, harassing the weakened pawn structure. Capturing the pawn simplifies into a stark queen and pawn endgame, where white's connected kingside majority will eventually prove decisive. Rallying behind the newly liberated rook, black aims to solidify their queenside presence and potentially create counterplay. This piece's journey to a2 is more than just a relocation. It signifies a shift in tactical focus, seeking to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn structure and exploit potential weaknesses along the second rank. The immediate consequence is an intensification of queenside tension, forcing white to reconsider their immediate defensive priorities. This maneuver also hints at a deeper positional understanding, as black seeks to activate dormant pieces and coordinate them for future action. The question now becomes whether white can adequately defend against this unexpected activation and maintain their material advantage. Reclaiming the outpost on c3 frees up the bishop to challenge the advanced knight, aiming to destabilize black's otherwise solid pawn structure. The rook now becomes an active pawn, potentially sacrificing itself to create a passed pawn on the b-file. Activating the rook along the 7th rank offers a significant positional advantage, threatening to infiltrate black's territory and exploit the pawn weakness on a4. The bishop's repositioning to e8 finally unlocks the queen's defense, a quiet but crucial maneuver to untangle its forces and prepare for potential counterplay along the central files or even a pawn push on the queen side. Initiating a decisive endgame push, the rook's repositioning offers immense pressure along the newly opened 8th rank, potentially trapping the black bishop or forcing concessions. A calculated sidestep towards safety, seeking to untangle the king from potential open lines while preparing to reposition it centrally for the impending endgame skirmish. The king's exposed position invites a check, forcing a repositioning that allows black to consolidate further. The king ventures out, seeking refuge on the queen side, but this exposed position could become a target for the rook if white can coordinate further. Dislodging the entrenched rook opens up lines for your pieces and forces black's king to become more exposed as the endgame looms. Suddenly, the black king finds itself thrust into the spotlight, no longer a safe haven but a potential target as it ventures toward the queen side. Activating the bishop to eye the pawn on a4 reestablishes pressure on black's queen side, aiming to exploit the immobility of the rook on a1. Unlocking the d-file for the rook is a sensible idea, as it finally brings the last major piece into the game's action. Consolidating the pawn structure feels like a prudent step, aiming to solidify the king's sanctuary against any potential infiltration attempts, even if it relinquishes a touch of central dynamism in the immediate aftermath. Seizing the open file and immediately activating the rook offers black a significant tempo, forcing white to react and potentially disturbing their defensive setup. A bold repositioning of the knight, aiming to disrupt the opponent's rook activity along the 2nd rank and potentially initiate a counterattack on the queen side. King's safety takes an immediate hit as the rook penetrates along the 1st rank, forcing the monarch into a perpetual check scenario that, while safe for now, offers no escape. A cautious step to activate the king, preparing to support the knight's escape route while simultaneously eyeing the pawn structure for potential weaknesses. The pawn push on g5, while seeming to offer the king a little more breathing room, dangerously weakens the pawn structure around the black monarch, potentially creating targets for white's rook on the h-file or even allowing a swift attack if white can reposition their pieces favorably. Unleashing the rook to this square immediately activates it, seeking to infiltrate the black position and exploit the exposed king, while also keeping an eye on the pawn. Securing the open file with the bishop is a shrewd maneuver, aiming to infiltrate white's defensive structure and exploit any weaknesses that arise from the recent pawn exchange. Unlocking the kingside requires careful attention to the opposing bishop's influence on the weakened dark squares around your monarch. Pushing that pawn forward is about more than just territory. It's about creating a new attacking vector down the kingside, forcing white to constantly consider the threat of a breakthrough and potentially opening lines for your rook if it can swing over later. Aggressively creating a pawn chain on the kingside, this move aims to stifle black's bishop and prevent any immediate counterplay there, potentially forcing black to commit to further pawn advances that could weaken their own king. Pressing that pawn forward creates an immediate pawn weakness on the g-file that could become a target, but it simultaneously gains breathing room for the king and establishes a more solid defensive structure on that side, potentially preparing for a later advance or piece repositioning. The rook advances, asserting control over a critical open file and preparing to potentially harass the black king or support a pawn push on the queen side. Unleashing a forceful bishop check, black desperately seeks to disrupt white's already precarious king position, aiming to expose a weakness before white can solidify their defenses. Protecting your king is paramount. Even a seemingly quiet square needs defending when enemy pawns are creeping forward. The black king, now exposed after the prior exchanges, finds itself in a precarious position, with white's rook on a4 poised to exploit potential weaknesses created by the pawn structure further down the board. Embracing the open diagonal, the knight relocates to a more proactive square, aiming to support a potential kingside advance or disrupt black's bishop pair dominance. The knight's journey to d2, while seemingly active, leaves the pawn chain on the kingside without adequate support, potentially creating weaknesses if white can advance their own pawns. Capitalizing on the exposed bishop, this capture aims to simplify the position and leverage the newfound rook activity on the open file. The king is suddenly exposed, a sitting duck after the rook's sacrifice, forcing an immediate reaction to avoid a swift checkmate. The king ventures forth, a bold gambit to escape the perpetual patrol of the rook on the third rank, seeking sanctuary behind the pawn wall, a precarious pilgrimage that might just pay off if the opposing rook can be lured away from its attacking post. The black bishop's sudden advance to g2, delivering a check, dramatically alters the immediate tactical landscape, forcing the white king into a vulnerable position and demanding a precise defensive response from white.